You're still awake? Or maybe you've just found your way here for the first time. Either way, you're safe. Welcome to the Lady Mythos. Here, we don't rush, we listen to the stories the world buried deep, to kings who turned into monsters, to shadows that stretched too long across the land. Before we return to Zahhak, if there's a story you'd like to hear, or a place you're listening from, I'd love to know. Leave a comment anytime. It helps me imagine the little circle we're all sitting in, even if they're scattered across different corners of the world. You, me, and the myths between us. When we left him, Zahhak sat secure on his throne, his serpents fed, his shadow heavy across the kingdom. Tonight, we'll follow the sparks that begin to rise against him. A boy in the mountains, a blacksmith with a banner, and a people who decide the night has lasted long enough. Chapter 5. The Seeds of Rebellion. If you want to glimpse the first crack in Zahhak's seemingly endless reign, you must leave the flatlands behind. Leave the crumbling road, the weary villages, the guarded whispers. Right northward, into the high country where the mountains rise like a wall against the sky. Here, the air is different. It is cooler, sharper, touched with the scent of pine and cedar. The wind has a voice of its own, not the heavy sigh of the plains, but a steady rush, like breath falls through narrow gates. In spring, the meadows gleam green, alive with grazing flocks. In autumn, the slopes turn bronze and gold. In winter, snow seals the passes, isolating the valleys, until the world feels narrowed to firelight, prayer, and endurance. It is in these highlands that Zahhak's shadow thins. His governors send men, but they come rarely, and the mountain clans obey slowly, if at all. For generations, they have lived by their own rhythms. Summer herding, winter hunting, nighttime gatherings around fires that blaze long into the dark. Here, people do not forget easily, and they do not bow quickly. It is here that the story begins to shift. The shahnameh roots rebellion in the life of one child, Ferdowsi. His father, Upton, should have been one more nameless victim, chosen to feed Zahhak's serpents. But Upton was among those saved by the compassion of the palace cooks, who mixed sheep's brains with human to spare lives in secret. Upton slipped away into hiding, and in time, he married a woman named Faranak. She was remembered as wise, strong, and steadfast, the kind of woman who understands both the dangers of her world and the strength required to survive it. When their son was born, They named him Feridun, and though no thunderbolt split the sky, no voice declared his destiny, both parents felt the quiet certainty that the boy was marked for something greater. They raised him far from the eyes of Zahhak, in a hidden pasture where cattle grazed among the slopes. There, one cow became central to his survival, Barmaya, the great cow of legend. She was no ordinary beast. Her milk was said to be nourishing beyond measure, rich with strength. Day after day, she fed the child, giving him health that glowed in his skin, strength that pulsed in his limbs. Later, when Feridun rose against Zahhak, people would say it was Barmaya's milk that made him a hero. Picture the scene: a rough wooden pen, the smell of straw and wild herbs, Pharaoh walking in the pale light of morning, her son clinging to her robe, the warmth of the cow's flank against the boy's hand, the steady rhythm of her breathing as she gave her milk. In this simple life, hope grew quietly. But Zahhak's reach was long. No rumor of rebellion could remain hidden forever. Word of a child born in the highlands, the son of a spared man, a child fed by the wondrous cow, drifted down into the plains, and eventually reached the ears of the Serpent King. And Zahhak, who feared any rival, was quick to anger. He sent men north to seek out the boy and kill him. Pharaoh, knowing what was coming, acted swiftly. She took her child and fled deeper into the mountains. There she entrusted him to a hermit, a wise man who lived apart from the world, clothed in rough wool, dwelling in silence and thought. It was in this hermitage that Feridun's training began. Training in such tales was never only about sword or spear. In Zoroastrian culture, a true hero was as much a guardian of Asha, truth and justice, as of borders and armies. That meant learning to judge fairly, to speak wisely, to keep one's word as if it were iron. And so, as Feridun grew, he learned both the strength of body and the strength of spirit. He learned to ride horses along steep, narrow paths, where a single misstep meant a fall into roaring rivers. He learned to read the sky, to know from the shape of clouds when snow would close the pass, and when storm winds would rise. He learned to track deer across snow and fox across stone, to hear the difference between the cry of an eagle and the warning call of a shepherd far off. These lessons mattered because they tied him to his land. The shahnameh's audience would have understood this deeply. A king who does not know his land cannot rule it. To be a hero was to be rooted in mountains, in rivers, in the cycles of earth itself. Meanwhile, in the plains below, Zahhak's cruelty pressed heavier. The quotas of young men continued. Taxes climbed. The roads crumbled further. Families broke under grief. And still, the story of the boy in the mountains spread. It began as a whisper, a rumor, a tale told in caravanserais over steaming bowls of lentil soup. A story murmured by mothers to calm frightened children. Somewhere, a child is growing. Somewhere, hope is alive. Some dismissed it as fantasy, a desperate dream. Others clung to it with fierce faith. Either way, the seed took root. The idea itself was dangerous, that there was someone who could stand against the Serpent King. In mythic time, years do not pass as they do for us. They can stretch into lifetimes, or vanish in a breath. What matters is the feeling, and the feeling under Zahhak's reign was of endless shadow. But in the mountains, Feridun was growing, and in the plains, Zahhak was feeding. Two worlds, one of hidden strength, one of rotting power, moving slowly toward collision. And somewhere unseen, Ahriman watched, as he always did. The destructive spirit knew what men often forget. No reign is eternal, not even one bought with blood and serpents. Sooner or later, every shadow meets the dawn. Chapter 6. The hero steps forward. By the time Feridun reached manhood, the world below the mountains had lived so long in shadow that people scarcely remembered sunlight. Zahhak's banners still flew above the palace. The serpents on his shoulders were fed without fail. Every day, two more names were taken, two more families broken. And yet, in the high county, where ridges cut the sky and valleys held their secrets close, a young man had grown strong in silence. Feridun was tall and broad-shouldered, but his strength was not the fragile strength of princes who sit on cushions and dine on honey. His was the strength of a herdsman, and by walking steep paths with the cattle, carrying loads over rocky ground, driving animals through mountain passes. The muscles in his arms came from work, not show. His balance was that of someone who knew the difference between solid stone and loose shale beneath his feet. He had grown up listening to the mountain's voice, the way the wind shifted when storms crept close, the subtle change in air that meant snow before nightfall, the silence that fell when predators hunted nearby. He knew how to approach an animal so it would not startle, how to coax trust out of a nervous horse, how to read the wariness in another man's eyes. The hermit who raised him had given him more than survival. He had given him the lessons of Asha, truth, order, justice, as the true foundation of kingship. A king who loses the people's trust, the old man told him, loses the earth beneath his feet. He may sit on a throne, but the ground will tremble, and one day it will cast him down. This was the opposite of Zahhak's reign, which clung together by fear alone. Feridun learned quietly, without boasting. But those who saw him knew he was not being hidden, he was being prepared. The spark that lit the flame came, as sparks so often do, from tragedy. One evening, news reached the highlands of yet another village emptied for serpents. Two brothers taken from their home, their family left hollow and broken. Feridun listened in silence, but his jaw tightened. That night, by the firelight, he spoke to his mother. "It will not stop," he said, "until someone stops him." Pharaoh, who had guarded him all his life, felt fear tighten around her heart. She had hidden his son from Zahhak's gaze, keeping him safe when others were lost. But she had also taught him that hiding is not living. She looked into her son's eyes and saw the man he had become. She gave him her blessing, but also a warning. "Strength alone will not topple Zahhak," she said. "His power is built on fear, and fear will not yield to muscle. If you would face him, you must win the people's trust. Only then will the throne shake beneath him." So Feridun began to gather men. At first, they were only a handful: hunters, herdsmen, men of the highland villages who had lost brothers or sons to the serpent's hunger. Some came quietly, slipping away from their homes in the night. Others arrived openly, carrying little more than a staff or an axe. Their grief burning hotter than their fear. From further away they came too, wanderers and traders who had heard the rumors of a hidden prince, of a boy who had grown strong under the milk of the sacred cow. These were not trained soldiers, not yet. They were ordinary men, hardened by loss, kept alive by the thin hope that someone might stand against the Serpent King. At first, there was no army, only a small band meeting in caves and abandoned watchtowers, speaking in low voices, avoiding the king's patrols. But the seed had been planted. Scattered discontent was being gathered into shape. Every cause needs a symbol. And in Persian epic, symbols matter as much as swords. The shahnameh tells us that a rallying banner against Zahhak began not as a silk embroidered with gold, but as a blacksmith's leather apron. That blacksmith was named Kaveh. He was no noble, no warrior, but a man who hammered iron day after day, whose hands were scarred with burn and callus. Zahhak had taken almost all of his sons. When the king's scribes summoned him to sign a proclamation declaring Zahhak a just ruler, Kaveh stood before the court in grief and fury. He tore the document apart with his bare hands, and then, before the nobles and soldiers, he lifted his leather apron from his chest, tied it to the spear, and raised it high. That moment became legend. The simple apron, stained with years of labor, became the first standard of rebellion. In later centuries, poets would call it the Derafsh Kaviani, the banner of kings. But here, it was only a piece of leather on a stick, trembling in the torchlight. And it was enough. Enough to show the people that defiance was possible. Kaveh's call spread like fire in dry grass. It leaped from one city to another, carried in angry whispers, in secret songs, in sudden acts of defiance. Caravans carrying the serpent's tribute were ambushed. Governors who demanded the quota were shouted down in their own halls. Markets closed their gates against Zahhak's soldiers. When word of this reached Feridun, he knew. The time of silence was over. The people were ready. The apron banner was no longer just cloth and leather. It was the cry of a nation. Zahhak, in his palace, heard the reports with disbelief. For centuries, his reign had been unchallenged. He had forgotten that fear is brittle. It cracks when pressed too hard, and once it breaks, it cannot be made whole again. Feridun gathered his companions and began to march south, toward the plains. The group was still small, but with each village they passed, more joined. Farmers laid down their plows. Shepherds brought their staffs. Merchants opened their stores to feed the marchers. And everywhere they went, people stitched cloth from their villages into the banner, so that the blacksmith's apron grew larger, heavier, brighter with each step. It was not yet an army capable of storming a capital, but it was something Zahhak had not faced in all his long centuries. The will of the people gathered and rising. The earth itself seemed to stir, trembling beneath the throne of the Serpent King. The reign of fear had met its first true challenger. Chapter 7. The Fall of the Serpent King. The march toward Zahhak's capital was not swift. It was not a single rush of men storming the gates, but a slow tightening, like a hunter drawing a noose around his prey. Feridun and his followers moved southward, step by step, village by village, and with every mile the rebellion swelled. Along the roads, people who had once fallen silent at the approach of the king's men now erupted into cheers when they saw the banner, the blacksmith's apron, patched with the cloth of 100 towns snapping in the wind. Every patch was a story, a place that had defied fear, a family that had given a son to the cause, a voice that refused to be silenced. It no longer looked like a mere apron. It looked like the soul of the people, stitched together and carried high. The capital stood on a rise, walled with pale stone that caught the sun. Once those walls had been symbols of protection, but under Zahhak they had become the walls of a cage. Inside, life continued with an uneasy rhythm. The markets still opened. The palace still gleamed. but there was a watchfulness in the air, a sense that everyone was waiting for something to break. From the hills beyond, Feridun and his commanders studied the city. They did not rush. First, they cut the supply lines, seizing caravans heavy with grain and salt. Roads were blocked, and the city's lifeblood slowed. Messengers slipped through the gates, whispering promises of mercy and fair rule to anyone who would open the city when the time came. The noose tightened. When Zahhak finally rode out, he was not the calm sovereign of old. He came armored in gold, the serpents at his shoulders writhing and hissing. His army still marched in formation, their shields gleaming, but their hearts were shaken. Too many had heard of Feridun's victories. Too many had brothers or cousins among the rebels. Fear held them in line, but only barely. The battle began at dawn. The first arrows darkened the sky. The beat of war drums rolled across the plain like thunder. At the front rode Feridun. In some tellings, he bore a great mace crowned with the head of a cow, in honor of Barmaya, the sacred cow that had nourished him as a child. In his hands, it was more than a weapon. It was the symbol of a destiny long prepared. The strength of the land itself made into iron. He swung in its wide arcs, scattering the enemy lines like reeds before a storm. Zahhak was no coward. He pressed the attack himself, the serpents striking, their venom deadly to any who came too near. His golden armor flashed as he drove into the fray, his voice carrying above the clash. But no matter how fiercely he fought, the tide was against him. For every rebel who fell, two more seemed to take his place. The Ahriman banner did not falter. All day the battle raged. Dust choked the air, arrows fell like rain. The earth shook with the tread of men and horses. And slowly, inexorably, Zahhak's lines gave way. In the end, Zahhak was not slain on the field. His crown did not roll in the dust. The shahnameh tells us that Feridun overcame him, bound him with chains of iron, and dragged him from his throne. It was deliberate, a refusal to grant him the dignity of a warrior's death. The serpents hissed and writhed, but without their daily tribute they weakened. The man who had once ruled for centuries, who had been more dread than human, now stood helpless before the people he had consumed. Here the epic turns solemn. Feridun, with victory in his grasp, chose not to kill Zahhak outright. Instead, he carried him north, to Mount Damavand. Damavand was no ordinary mountain. It rose above the plains like a titan of stone, its crown wrapped in snow even in summer. In Persian tradition, it was the place of exile for forces too dangerous to be loosed upon the world. There, in the deep caverns of the mountain, Zahhak was chained. The iron shackles bit into his limbs. the rock itself sealing around him. And there, legend says, he remains still. Not dead, but imprisoned. Not gone, but waiting. At the end of days, when the world tips towards its final reckoning, Zahhak will break free for one last battle before he is destroyed forever. This ending does two things at once. It frees the people, but it does not erase the danger. It closes the reign, but leaves the shadow alive in memory. When the gates of the capital finally opened to Ferdowsi, the streets were lined with people. Some wept openly, clutching their children. Others stared in stunned silence, unable to believe the serpent's reign had ended. The fire temples blazed again with joy, their priests lifting prayers they had not dared to speak for years. Markets filled with color and song, and the blacksmith's apron, once a simple piece of leather, now the standard of a nation, was carried into the palace itself, a reminder that power belongs to the people when they stand together. For a time, justice returned. Roads were cleared. Tribute ended. The scars of Zahhak's centuries began slowly to heal. And yet, in the north, Damavand stood tall, holding the prisoner who was not truly gone, whose story did not end with his reign. It lingered, waiting, a shadow at the edge of memory. Chapter 8. The Legacy of Zahhak. The clinking of chains on Mount Damavand is not just the sound of a tyrant's end. It is the beginning of a memory. A story once lived becomes something else when it moves into the keeping of a people. It is no longer only about a man or a reign. It becomes a mirror, a warning, a shadow that walks beside every generation. Zahhak did not vanish when Ferdowsi chained him. He lived on as symbol, as caution, as ghost. For centuries, before Ferdowsi set ink to parchment, Zahhak's tale lived in the breath of storytellers. These were not fixed recitations, but living performances. In one village, the bard might dwell on Zahhak's cruelty. In another, he might linger on Kave's defiance. Some listeners heard the story by firelight on long winter nights. Others in caravanserais along the Silk Road, or during the festivals of Nowruz when old stories flowed as freely as the wine. The story shifted with every telling. Each listener carried it home, reshaped by memory and need. And yet, the core remained. The tyrant with serpents on his shoulders, the people's banner, the hero who chained evil in the mountain. When Ferdowsi composed the shahnameh around the year 1000 CE, he did more than record these tales. He gave them architecture. He placed Zahhak in the long sweep of Persian history, shaping him into part of the eternal struggle between Asha, truth, order, justice, and Druj, the lie, the corruption sown by Ahriman. Zahhak became not merely a king gone wrong, but the very embodiment of the destructive spirit, a reminder that chaos and tyranny always wear human faces. Across the centuries, Zahhak's image has risen again whenever rulers turned cruel. To call a man Zahhak was not just to insult him, it was to accuse him of feeding upon his people, of draining their lives for his own hunger. The serpents were no longer literal. They became greed, corruption, exploitation. The blacksmith Kaveh, lifting his apron banner, became a symbol of resistance. His act was retold in times of oppression, reminding people that tyranny is not eternal, that even the longest reign can be broken when the people stand together. In poetry, in protest, in whispered defiance, Kaveh's apron flew again and again. And always behind the story loomed Mount Damavand. Rising more than 5,000 meters, its snowy crown visible for days' journey, Damavand is not simply a mountain in Persian imagination. It is sentinel, a keeper, a prison. The shahnameh tells us Zahhak still lies chained within its depths, bound by Feridun's hand. But in some traditions, those chains are not eternal. One day, at the world's end, Zahhak will break free. He will pour forth from the mountain with his serpents hissing to lead a final battle between chaos and order. And only then, in the last reckoning, will he be destroyed. This apocalyptic thread keeps the story alive. It reminds listeners that evil is never fully gone. It can be chained, it can be buried, but waits. Vigilance is always required, because the serpent is always hungry. Scholars sometimes peer through the myth, searching for the history beneath. Perhaps the serpents on Zahhak's shoulders were once horns on a crown, remembered and retold until they wriggled into living things. Perhaps his long reign echoes distant memories of Mesopotamian kings or foreign invaders who held Persia in fear. Archaeology cannot prove the tale, but it reveals that world that shaped it. Fortified cities on the plains, high mountain passes, and the constant exchange of stories along the trade routes that linked Persia to Babylon, India, and beyond. Why has Zahhak's name lasted 1,000 years and more? Perhaps because he's at once monstrous and familiar. Few rulers grow serpents, but many drain their people's lifeblood. Few are changed inside mountains, but many are remembered as warnings. Zahhak is both larger than life and uncomfortably close. And then there are the serpents themselves. Vivid, unforgettable. They are hunger given form, a reminder that tyranny is not satisfied by wealth or tribute, only by the consuming of life itself. Across cultures, when storytellers wanted to mark a ruler as irredeemable, they gave him a monstrous appetite. Zahhak's serpents made his cruelty visible, carved into his very flesh. Stand at the foot of Mount Damavand on a clear day, and you will see only rock, snow, and the slow drift of clouds. But if you know the story, you will feel something more. You will feel the weight of chains inside the mountain, the restless stir of serpents in the dark. You will feel the hush of a people who for 1,000 years have remembered the lesson. The Serpent King is gone, but not destroyed. His shadow lingers, warning every new generation of the hunger that power can become. And high above, the banner that first rose against him, the blacksmith's apron, patched and raised on a spear, still flies in memory. A reminder that even the longest night breaks, that even the oldest shadow fades, and that when people hold steady to the light, no tyrant, no serpent, no shadow can rule forever. You've been listening to the Lady Mythos, where forgotten stories breathe again. If your eyes are still open, let them close now. Let the mountain winds grow still, and the chains on Damavand fall quiet in your mind. And if you're already dreaming, perhaps you'll meet him there. Not as a king, not as a tyrant, but as a warning carved into stone. A man who listened to the wrong whisper, who carried serpents on his shoulders, and who waits still in the dark. A shadow reminding us that even the longest rain can be broken. Sweet dreams, sleep tight, and thank you for listening.